The question that I get all the time these days is the question of how do you know that God exists? And a lot of young people are asking me this question. A lot of Muslim youth have this question in their minds. And, it's a legitimate question. How do we know that God exists? And when I'm asked this, I try to focus on two things. I think there are two basic assumptions that really underlie the confusion that people have on this question. And the two assumptions are, one, people have this kind of scientific view of knowledge where they think that if you don't have scientific proof of God, then there's no reason to believe that God exists. You have to have some kind of scientific evidence. You have to have some scientific proof. And this is something that's really emphasized by new atheists, like Richard Dawkins, for example, or Sam Harris, or whoever else. They really emphasize this scientific view of knowledge. The only way that you can know something for certain is if you have scientific evidence and scientific proof that you can, publish in a paper or whatever else. So that's one assumption that a lot of people have, and it's because of this influence from new atheists. And the other assumption is that, if you really want to know that God exists, you have to have some kind of logical proof. There has to be some kind of deductive proof that you present that proves, without a shadow of a doubt, in a logical fashion, that God exists. So these are the two assumptions that people have about knowledge, about how you can know things in the world. And so if theology, if the existence of God doesn't meet that high standard, or that standard at all, then that must mean that there's no reason to believe that God exists, and for all intents and purposes, He doesn't. And so this is the confusion that a lot of Muslim youth have, a lot of non-Muslims have as well. It leads a lot of people to leave religion, unfortunately, and to leave Islam. Unfortunately, there are many examples that I've come across of Muslims who were born Muslim. They're very practicing Muslims in terms of praying and fasting, but they hear these kinds of arguments and it just gets stuck in their brain, it gets stuck in their mind, and they can't get rid of that doubt. And so it causes a fitna for them. It causes them to leave Islam. It causes them to just disbelieve in God altogether. And so that's a tragedy, and we have to have some way of addressing that. And the very easy way to address this kind of idea, or these kinds of misconceptions about the question of how do we know that God exists, is to just attack those assumptions about what knowledge means. If you have this idea that the only things that you know and are certain of are those things that are scientific or are proven logically through some kind of deductive proof, that's a very narrow, that's a very specific view of knowledge. And it's inaccurate. It's a complete misconception. There are so many things that we know in our everyday lives, in our everyday experience, that have nothing to do with science, have nothing to do with deductive proof, and yet we know them. We know them very certainly, and I can give you examples of that in a second. But the idea, it's important to keep this in your mind, that, look, if it's true that there are certain things, many things that we know without scientific or logical proof, then why is it a problem if we don't necessarily know God by those very specific means, by that very narrow conception of how we can know something that you've specified? So that's the general gist of the argument that I try to make. And so what are some other things that we know, we all know, and we all experience very personally, very deeply, but again, they have nothing to do with science or logical proof? I'll give you a few examples. One, consciousness. Our minds, our hearts, our emotions, everything that we experience in our every waking moment. Our dreams, for example, those are also parts of the mind. Even when we're sleeping, we're experiencing things. So experiences, the mind, consciousness, those are not things that can be proven in terms of science. They're not things that can be dissected in a lab. They're not things that can be put under a microscope. They're completely outside the realm of scientific analysis. And this is something that philosophers and even scientists accept. And you might say, well, you can look at the brain, you can look at electrical signals in the human brain, and you can do all this kind of neurological imaging, but that's a misconception because the brain is an organ. And the organ of the brain, the material of the brain, is not the same thing as our minds. They're completely categorically different things. The human mind is something that it cannot be reduced to just electrical signals in the brain, and this is something that philosophers again have recognized, and they call it, they even have a name for it, they call it the hard problem of consciousness. This idea that you can't reduce things that happen in your mind, like the thoughts that you have, the content of your thoughts and your experiences, those phenomenological aspects of who you are cannot be put in terms of a formula or something that you see in a a CAT scan, and that's just a brute fact about the limits of science, and it's something that everyone recognizes. I'll give you another example. Any kind of history, really. History is something that is not scientifically proven. There are historical records that people think are accurate, but there's no scientific proof that everything that is recorded in history books is necessarily accurate. In fact, a lot of history we know to be inaccurate later. We discover to be inaccurate. This is something that is notorious in a lot of Western history, is that history can be written in a very biased way. History books can be very manipulative in how they present facts and how they present the historical record. A lot of things are made up when we look at kind of a lot of Western history and the history of other cultures. It's something that is not, it's outside of scientific inquiry. There's no way that we can build a time machine and go into the past and empirically study like exactly what happened. We just have to rely on accounts of what has happened from the past, and in most cases just trust that what we hear is true. Maybe in some cases there's corroborating evidence. Even in Islamic epistemology we have this idea of tawatur, that you have so many witnesses reporting the same thing that it's impossible rationally that they could have all colluded with each other to make up a lie. So maybe for certain events in history there is that kind of preponderant evidence and different testimony all coming together to report a single version of a story. But for the vast majority of what we read in our history classes in college and high school, wherever, is not at that level of certainty or that level of verification. So you might say, well, none of this is scientific, so how do we know about it? So that's another simple example. But also the notion of time. Time is something that's very conceptual. It's something that philosophers have been thinking about for thousands of years, for millennia. What is time? And again, it's not something that you can put in a petri dish. It's not something that you can study under a microscope. You might think that we have a notion of time in terms of physics and other sciences, like there is a concept of time, but again, that's something that's more conceptual. And time itself, in the terms of like, is time made of anything? Like, is time a material? That's something that people have not agreed upon. It's something that's more metaphysical rather than scientific, and something that you study in philosophy and not necessarily studied in science. Like, what is the actual nature of time? So these are just examples of things that, again, are not encapsulated by science, but we know that they exist. We all experience time. We all experience our minds, our dreams, what happens in our consciousness. We experience history. Like, there are things in our personal histories that we know to have happened in the past. Like, we know them, but it's, again, not something that we can provide scientific proof of. So that's, even think about your own life. So many things that may have happened to you, there's no necessarily any record of that. All you have are your memories, but memories are just in your head. How can you prove that to anyone? There's no science that would be relevant in that situation. Also, colors. This is a good analogy. Like, again, it has to do with the mind, but we experience colors when we look out into the world. As long as we're not colorblind, we see all kinds of reds, blues, greens, and those colors are something that defy the kind of explanation or scientific explanation that we could give someone. And I know that we have a science of light, optics. We know that colors have to do with the wavelengths of light and how our eyes work, and sure, that's all scientific. But how do you explain, like imagine someone who's colorblind. How do you explain to a colorblind person what color is? Like imagine a person who doesn't have any color vision. They see all in black and white or grayscale. How do you explain to such a person what red is? You can explain the wavelengths of light, you can explain optics, you can explain the physics and the science of it, but they're not going to feel and experience what seeing red actually means. And I think that's a great analogy for the idea of explaining how God exists to someone that has no faith in that or has no iman. How can you explain color to someone who's colorblind? Is the same way. When, as Muslims and theists generally, we have the way that we experience God, we experience the ayat, the signs of Allah, the signs of God around us. We experience the world through that lens. We know that we are a creation, that we have a master who has created us, that we're part of this bigger picture, and that's how we see the world. That's our worldview, that's our paradigm, and that's how we speak about ourselves in the world and our relationship to our Creator. But if someone doesn't have that, that language, they don't have that experience, it's like they're seeing the world in black and white, and it's really hard for someone who sees in color to explain color to such a person. So that's an analogy that I would also use in talking about how, the experience of God, how we know that God exists. But the other major assumption that people have, other than this kind of scientific view of knowledge, is that we have to have deductive proof. We have to have a logical proof of God if we are to believe or have reason to believe that God exists. And this is also a mistake. Again, it's trying to have this you have this very narrow conception of knowledge and how we can know something, and you're trying to say, oh, because God doesn't fit into that narrow definition, then it must mean that he doesn't exist. But again, this is a misconception, because there are many things that, again, we know, we experience, we have very intimate knowledge about. Some of the things that we're most intimately aware of in our lives, our emotions, our thoughts, our feelings, the different states within us, and also what we experience outside in the world, have nothing to do with logical proof. So to think that, oh, just because we can't prove God exists through this logical proof, that must mean that he doesn't exist, or that we have no reason to believe he exists, that's why. Why would you think that? It just makes no sense that you would have that expectation. And this is something that you might say, and someone might respond to that by saying that, well, doesn't that mean that you're being irrational, that you're denying logic, that you're denying science? And that's not what we're doing. We're not saying that science is invalid, or that logic is invalid, or that we don't believe in rationality or being reasonable, or we don't believe in logic. That's not what we're saying at all. We're saying that you have a very narrow view of knowledge. You have a very tiny understanding of what kind of knowledge there is out there. Really, our knowledge can be very expansive, and the way that we know things around us is based on much more than just science and logical proof. So it's invalid, it's an incorrect assumption to say that only these avenues of knowing or these avenues of knowledge are acceptable and everything else is invalid. So we don't accept that. Our view of rationality is much broader than that. Our view of knowledge is much broader than that. And different thinkers and philosophers have noted this and made this distinction throughout history. I'll give you one example from Islamic history and then one example from Western history or Western analytic philosophy. Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, he was a big proponent of this idea that if you try to prove the existence of God using only rational or deductive logical proof, that doesn't work. You won't be able to give a satisfactory proof of the existence of God, or if you do prove something, it's not going to be the same God that we know of in the Quran, who is Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, Al-Malik, Al-Quddus, and so on. You're going to just prove, some abstraction maybe, but it's not going to be the God that we know, Allah, that is described in the Quran. And so he says that, Ibn Taymiyyah says that there are so many other ways that we know about the world around us, and there are so many other ways that we know about Allah. We have ayat, we have signs from Allah, we read the Quran, we read His book, we hear about the prophets, the Anbiya, we hear about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we hear about his miracles, we even in everyday life we see things and experience things within ourselves or outside in nature, or when we hear about the vastness of the universe, and in our personal lives as well, things happen to us, we have emotions, and so there are all these different things that can happen that elicit our thoughts about God and Allah, and we feel that. And when we pray, for example, in different ibadat, when we worship Allah, these are means by which we get closer to Him, by really devoting ourselves to Him, having ikhlas, having sincerity in our worship, really trying to achieve that yaqeen, that certainty. These are all methods or avenues by which we know God and we experience Him and His signs. So Ibn Taymiyyah is one big example, and in Western thought, another philosopher that's worth looking up is Stanley Cavell, and he has this book called The Claim of Reason, and he also argues that we can't have this very narrow notion of reason and rationality, that in fact rationality is much more expansive than just purely deductive proof or purely scientific reasoning. And he gives a lot of great examples, so that's another book that I would definitely check out. So just to summarize, what we're saying here is that people ask, how do you know God exists? And oftentimes when they ask that question, they have a couple of assumptions behind that. They assume oftentimes that if you don't have scientific proof of God, then that means you have no reason to believe that He exists. If you don't have a logical proof of God, then you have no reason to believe that He exists. But that's incorrect. We don't limit ourselves to just those two types of proof or those two types of knowledge. In fact, our knowledge is much more expansive than that. How we know things and how we know about the world around us is much more expansive, and we don't have these kinds of narrow, this narrow view of how we perceive the world around us. So that's how I would address this question. This is how I've addressed it in the past. I'm interested to hear what you guys think. Feel free to comment on the video and leave your questions or suggestions. And ultimately, hopefully you'll be able to better address this question using some of these ideas that I've given you, and inshallah it'll be beneficial. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.